Hello, guys. This is Vihang. We are back again after a brief hiatus. These are our podcasts about effortless prosperity. We have Bhavin today with us. He's our guest. Bhavin needs no introduction. He's a great friend, holistic coach, and uh, a really good human being. Hi Bhavin, how are you?
Hi Vihang, doing awesome after the summer holiday and so look forward to restart this journey of podcasts with you for a while. Yes.
Yeah. So, I was away because I was on a holiday in the US, and you know, uh, so what we thought is we could this podcast could focus on basically what India should learn from the West in terms of prosperity learnings, and maybe then what India could teach the West in terms of prosperity. So, Bhavin, would you want to uh, just give your thoughts on the topic? What do you think about what could we learn from the West? Definitely, just to give you a background today, you know, India used to be one of the world's most wealthiest countries just about 300 years ago. India accounted for about 27% of the global GDP. And now, after independence in 1947, India accounted for about 3% of global GDP. Right now, we are at around $2,000 per capita of GDP, while the US is almost about 30, 40 times that. So definitely, there is something that the West has done right, and we could take those learnings forward. So Bhavin, your thoughts on same?
Yes, Vihang, this topic is deep interest in some ways because as an Indian, by default we are wired to be so proud of India given our divine heritage and somewhere along the way we perhaps retained some aspects of the heritage, but we definitely lost out on the material aspect of our heritage. And you rightly cited this example of where we were a few centuries ago, maybe before the British or the India company uh, came in. But if we go back to the Vedic era, and if not the Vedic, at least the Upanishadic era, which you can place anywhere between 2500 to 4000 BC. It was a Swarnim Bharat. It was golden age, and when we say golden, we mean golden. We actually were deeply prosperous. So we surely seem to have gone wrong somewhere, and what I guess we should endeavor to discuss is not just what India could learn from the West, but what an Indian can learn from a Westerner. That's perhaps what would make it far more relevant for our audience, because a country is only as good as her people, and when her people choose to operate by some doctrines which help, the whole country prospers. So, yes, that's my initial thoughts on that, Vihan. If you would want to add something to that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so one of the things that I observed, I don't know, you have traveled as well, but one of the things that I have observed whenever I have traveled to some of these developed countries, is that as a tourist, you don't have to constantly watch your back. What I mean is, I don't know if you would agree to this, but there seems to be a lot of emphasis on integrity and honesty and the basic values, such as righteousness in many of these countries, especially America. It might not seem right to say that they are more honest, but the average experience, whether it is in a taxi or whether it is with a shopkeeper, whether when you while you're shopping, it seems as though that's one of the attribute that stands apart. Do you want to elaborate on this aspect of Bhavin? What's been your experience?
Yes, I do totally see what you're saying, and I can relate to your experience. Even when I traveled to the US for a month in 2015, I did notice that there is a huge difference between the average levels of being transparent, the average levels of transparency of a Westerner vis-a-vis that of an Indian. An Indian, though it might sound perhaps a little crude, but an Indian comes across as, at least a current Indian comes across as somebody who does carry far greater hypocrisy than his Western counterpart, and it seems that well, that's just one of the things. We are hardworking and we are intelligent, and we have the genes of our rishis and the gotras of the Aryans. But apparently, our rishis and our Aryans were deeply in integrity while they were intelligent, whereas we surely seem to have relinquished that aspect. I mean, both of us, yourself and me, Vihan, stay in Mumbai, so the contrast is not so much. But I do see that in some of the other cities of the country, let us just call a spade a spade. There definitely is tremendous potential of being conned even by a cabbie or an average tourist guide and all of that. So we see such experiences. We have ourselves gone through a lot of these things, having lived in India all this while. So I do agree with you that honesty is definitely one department where a huge dent has been created. Uh,
Right,
and
right.
yeah,
But then,
yeah.
this is on honesty is a very personal attribute, and which is this is something that gets taught in schools. What does it have to do with prosperity? Many of us would ask.
Oh, sure. Apparently, like for example, I basically, because all my training comes from is on the basis of spirituality. I tend to bring these analogies. Uh, you know, Lakshmi is the consort of Vishnu, and Vishnu is Narayana. And in India, we honor, one of the vrats that we live by is the Satyanarayan Vrat. So that Satyanarayan stands for Narayana in the form of Satya. And Satya is integrity. Satya is congruence of body, mind, and action. Uh, so, or body, mind, and speech rather. So, when a person is in congruence in terms of what he thinks, what he speaks, and what he does, that's when he is in Narayana. And then when the husband is with you, the wife is with you. So prosperity is a natural result of being in integrity. This is the mythological basis, and looking at the whole thing from a more pragmatic standpoint, it is honesty alone which translates into customer service. Without integrity, you always want to cut the corners here and there. You always want to think short term. You always want to be committed to your pockets rather than the experience that you're giving to your client. So, at the end of the day, anything that is short of integrity, how is it going to translate into business?
Right, right. That's a great point, Bhavin. Linking trust to in our mythology, some of the lessons that we've forgotten. Also, I think it's a very interesting thing that trust forms the backbone of business because um, you're basically, if I sell you let's say an apple, and you pay me in cash, in currency. Basically, the transaction implies that both of us trust in the government and the Reserve Bank of the country to uphold the value of that piece of paper. So
Sure.
that's where the genesis of trust lies, right from the currency that we exchange. So things become a lot more easier if we live in a culture where trust is valued, and people are easily able to trust each other. Otherwise, what really happens in every transaction we make is we keep have to employ hordes of lawyers to dot every I and to cross every T, and that just increases the cost of doing business. Now, some of our readers, and I empathize with them for this, some of our listeners would think that America is developed. America is honest because it's developed, and India is might be the reasons we sometimes cut corners is because we are undeveloped, underdeveloped, or developing in that sense. While that might have a figment of truth, it is much easier to be honest if my tummy is filled, and I might be bent to really steal if I would die of hunger. While that is true, I would really argue that it's the other way around. If a society as a whole, values trust and honesty, it is much easier to do business in this society, and that's where the fruits of prosperity come trickling in. Uh, a good example here is would be a developed country, uh, which is which doesn't really rank very high in terms of honesty. And what's really happening with that country? One country that comes to most travelers' minds, where I think you have the highest chances of getting robbed,
Sure.
is in Italy, in Europe.
Oh yes, I did get robbed in Venice. I lost my wallet only to find it a few hours later in the police station. Apparently, it also managed to reach the police station.
Well,
But
with the
but
cash
yes,
or without the cash?
yes, with the cash. I don't know what exactly
Oh wow,
happened, but yeah, somehow I managed to find my wallet. As it is, maybe I was extra lucky. But
wow,
yes, I definitely was robbed. Yes.
wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
so a lot of us. I mean, I was in Rome and I didn't get robbed, but I saw a lot of my roomies losing their cell phones and their wallets. So it's rampant. So any traveler to Europe would tell you to be cautious in Italy. Now that's a country which is a very high developed country. A European country in that. However, there is a fair level of trust deficit, as if I could use that euphemism, in the society, and that trust deficit really could be one of the reasons why. it has lagged behind in many economic indicators, apart from the other things, like excessive spending, etc. But one of the ills of the society there is this trash deficit, and somehow, you can see that country really falling apart in terms of all economic indicators now. What I wanted to really explain here is that while we might want to believe that uh, development brings honesty, I think the correlation lies the other way around, in which in case that honesty really brings development as a society. Yeah.
Sure, sure. And I especially like this whole point you mentioned around employing a whole host of lawyers to dot the I's and check the P's, because that's what seems to have also happened in this country. Not that, I wouldn't want any of our listeners to feel that we are in any ways denigrating India. In fact, I'm proud to be an Indian for many other reasons, and I really, really long for India to do better, even materially. And it is in that spirit that we're discussing. We are actually allowing ourselves to call a spade when it comes to the condition of India, so that we can do something about it. So I was coming to this whole point that what seems to have also happened. I have worked for many years, and I'm still on the fringes, a part of a private limited company, and because it's our own company, I know the amount of regulations. If you have a factory, there are at least 24 departments that you have to comply with. And even after the onset of recent GST and all of these so-called progressive measures that the Modi government is bringing in, but one thing that does remain is that it is only increasing the amount of work that an average entrepreneur has to do in terms of complying to the government. Now, how does this relate to our discussion? What it actually, we require all sorts of checks and balances. We require all sorts of inspection and vigilance and policing around us, only when we don't trust each other. So when the general ambience of the country is such wherein the average citizen is going to explore and exploit every loophole, and he's going to do his best to evade all the tax, and he also does a lot of this because he doesn't want to fuel the pockets of corrupt politicians. So once lack of integrity sets in, then even the average citizen doesn't want to comply with the tax laws of the country, and then the country has to employ 1,000 more eyes to check upon this person. In the process, business itself, owing to the cumbersome reporting, becomes so monotonous, and that eats into the very productivity of doing business in the country.
Correct.
I mean, perhaps even you must have. I see these things more from because I'm sort of a desi entrepreneur, but you perhaps have a certain vision into all these things from a corporate standpoint. If there's anything that you would want to validate or add in what I just mentioned.
Oh, all
Or
the
it's going
time.
to counter it either
No,
way. Yes.
all the time, all the time. So one of the things that we as a country have faced, a challenge is just tax compliance now. It's about the honesty. You are sitting in your car and you come across a pothole, and you bump, your car just bumps on the pothole, and you start cursing the government about how ill maintained the roads are. But then, you know, in the car, what you're discussing with your CA about how to, evade taxes,
Yes,
so,
yes,
it's so visible, if you want to see it, that, India has got one of the highest amount of tax evasion, and it has, in the country of its size, it has got the least number of people paying taxes as a percentage of its population, and and then you really complain. So if you just end up paying your taxes, which is an honest duty of any citizen, I'm sure, the country as a whole, the environment for your business would change, and that would lead to prosperity. Now, a lot of it might seem like a sermon, Bhavin. I mean,
sure.
and we are no one to really sermonize here. These are just observations that come very starkly to you whenever you spend a lot of time outside of India. I don't know if many of our listeners will appreciate this, but both of us are definitely in our own small way, doing a lot of things to improve the situation around. And as Bhavin mentioned, we all of us love our country, and sometimes it just helps to, if it's your child and his behavior and you don't like his behavior, rather than rolling it under the carpet, it just helps to call it bad behavior and try to correct it. Um, so yeah, so I think
Sure,
we should just,
sure.
maybe we've made the point on trust. Is there any other thing that you would like to contribute or share, Bhavin?
There's one, we should perhaps also look at how is it that we ended up, on the whole as a race, how is it that we ended up giving into these tendencies of thinking short term or losing integrity and losing trust upon each other. And that might make for an interesting study. While I should admit that I don't have deep research around it, but well, it is quite obvious that one of the things that seems to have hampered the country is the way in which its morale and the way in which its sense of dignity was compromised at the hands of too many invaders.
Right.
And so that is, one might want to say that it's not entirely the country's fault, or it is not entirely the government's fault, but uh, just like how you mentioned that when a person doesn't have bread to bake for his evening, there's a chance that he might, in the afternoon, he might go out and rob someone. So it's a fact of life. It's a cold hard fact. So in the same way, there's this another cold hard fact that for centuries together, we have been plundered. And while I am a spiritualist at heart, I also have a feeling that a culture which is inclusive, but it is at the same time lopsided towards ahimsa, and kind of stretches ahimsa or even patience to ridiculous proportions, might have to bear the brunt of invasions, and in the process, its self-esteem, its morale, and how it feels about itself is definitely going to get compromised. So, relating it to our average listener, as an Indian, our self-esteem has definitely been badgered. It has definitely suffered, and that is one reason why perhaps that was the entire endeavor of Swami Vivekananda of bringing back the dignity of the divine heritage of this country in the minds of every Indian, and that's what every social reformer also tried. And I think that alone seems to be a solution which will eventually help us overwhelm these strong pressures of lack of self-esteem and feeling ashamed about where we are. I'm wondering if you have some thoughts around this, Johan.
Yeah, a lot of what we spoke about and a lot of what we see right now going on in the country should be juxtaposed to the fact that we are a country, we have a history unlike any other country in that sense, because, nowhere in the world, was such a rich civilization subjugated and mistreated and ill-governed for such a long time. And obviously, it's just been around 50, 60 years since that subjugation has ended. It's too early for, obviously, the scars of all that, have remained. And I encourage all our listeners to, read books like, you know, The Rebel Sultans by Manu Pillai, or The Age of Darkness, which basically describes the British period by Shashi Tharoor. These are some of the books that describe how, prosperous we were. And I'm not talking about the Vedic period, even in the Mughal rule, how prosperous India was. And then how a couple of centuries of ill governance basically plundered it all away. Obviously, all of this discussions about values and about trust and about honesty, it is, in economic terms, it is like somebody, somebody basically invades America today and brings it down to the level of Africa, for example, in terms of all economic indicators. Yeah. In a fairly short time of history, 200 years is not a long time in the history of our civilization. So obviously, then it takes a longer time to recover. However, these are some of the things that are also interestingly, while Bhavin, we're talking about invasions, it's very interesting to know that the way invasions took place in India. If you read about the Battle of Plassey, you know, uh, it's so funny that it was a battle which was fought between Robert Clive of the East India Company and Shirazuddaulah, who was the governor of Bengal. And there was no way that Robert Clive, with a handful of British citizens, could have, conquered a rich province like Bengal. However, what really helped him was, Shirazuddaulah, the Mughal king, the Mughal governor, his commander-in-chief, Mir Zafar, went to the battle with Shirazuddaulah to fight Robert Clive, and then instead fought Shirazuddaulah himself. So,
Yeah.
so
Yes.
the whole army turned against its own, and without much bloodshed, the empire really fell. That was and that possibly. I mean, I don't know. I'm no one to comment because I was not around there at that time, but. But it just shows how a degradation of values like trust really leads to an alteration in history, right? So, you know,
Sure. Sure.
if a king can't trust his general, the civilization then possibly deserves to uh, to have a change in the ruler. So that's how it happened, and it brings us back to our first point about trust and honesty. Yeah.
Yes, and I would, yes, this particular example the whole thing around Mir Jafar. Yes, even amongst friends, if somebody betrays each other, then that's what we, even so many centuries later say that ye Mir Jafar nikla.
Yeah.
So yeah, it has become such a classic analogy. So I do agree, and to relate it to our dear listeners and to yourself and myself and an average Indian, I guess this entire historicity, what it teaches us is what is the actionable in terms of our daily lives in order to build our prosperity back. In order to bring our country to the kind of divine material heritage that it had, is I guess that on a daily basis, each of us should be, regardless of where we stand on the financial spectrum, on a daily basis we should build back our self-esteem primarily, which will result in we trusting in ourselves, and in the process others will trust in us, and we should build back the core values of being seen as reliable by our brothers around us. It's because it's very easy to say that we should trust each other, but actually that's not what we have to do. We have to become trustworthy. Nobody's going to be able to trust an untrustworthy person. So it's not for us to trust others, but it's for us to become trustworthy. So in terms of our daily lives, in order to bring not just the country back to its golden era, but in order for our businesses to flourish, in order for our personal revenue streams to become larger, in order for us to also do service to each other, I think the primary lesson that we should be learning here from the West is how each of us can ourselves offer such service to each other, and if there is something like the trustworthiness index, we should jump there. We should grow by leaps and bounds and do something on a daily basis to
Excellent.
upswing that index.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Good. Those were great closing remarks, Bhavin. And what I could do is I'll just summarize it a bit for our readers, for our listeners today. What we basically wanted to uh, give our readers a few learnings about what we can learn from the West in terms of the prosperity consciousness. The first thing, we mostly spoke about trust today. You made a great point, Bhavin, about Satyanarayana and how our culture, talks about trust and prosperity together. Uh, we also spoke about, whether honesty really leads to development, or development, leads to honesty. And we found out with with the example of Italy, that it's typically honesty which leads to a development as a society. Also, we said how having a higher trust index, ranking high on the trust index, basically reduces the cost of doing business. You don't have to dot your I's and cross your T's. You basically trust each other. You also made a good point, Bhavin, about going back, about how did we lose our values, and the possibility that it could be because of the continuous onslaught of invasions that we had, and the reduction in prosperity that basically moved us towards losing our dignity and other values. We saw how Mir Jafar, betrayed Siraj-ud-Dawla, and how the British, with just a handful of soldiers, could rule a country of our size and population for a couple of centuries. And we closed it by discussing, how. it is important to be trustworthy before demanding trust from others. And if you yourself are trustworthy in your business, how it's easy for someone else to trust you and act likewise. So I think it was a great discussion, Bhavin. Do you want to have some closing remarks?
Oh yes, I think you have this really wonderful knack of putting things in a nutshell. And yes, in the end, all that I feel called to share is this positive note that despite whatever cultural erosion and erosion of values, we somehow have, such huge blessings that we nevertheless are a growing country and the world is yet looking up to India. And then history has its way of moving around in a cyclical manner. So we're not being skeptical that we have been doomed to something which is irreversible. Rather, we are far more hopeful that as and how we rebuild these values at a personal level, as in how every citizen rebuilds these values at the level of his home and his transactions and his business, the country is once again going to be very much self-reliant, and we would once again be in a place where we should perhaps be able to feel deeply dignified about where we are. So, yes, that's it. We hung. I think we seem to have had a nice full circle conversation around this entire topic.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you, Bhavin. Thank you for your ideas. That was really a fruitful discussion. I hope our listeners like it. Do let us know what do you think about our thoughts. And yeah, that's it from our side. Ciao.
Yes, bye. Thank you so much, Vihan. Goodbye. See you.